Hey guys, real quick before we start the video, I want to direct you to the community tab on my channel. I am currently running an event for you, the viewers, to rate every single Monster Hunter monster from 1 to 5 stars. This project is going to be a bit of a run back from the 20th anniversary popularity poll and is meant to allow everyone to voice their opinion on every monster, so we can get a big picture look at how the whole community feels about the entire Monster Hunter bestiary. There will be a new poll on the community tab every single day at noon Eastern Standard Time, and all polls will remain live on the channel, so you can answer any of them at any time. You will not miss out if you miss the poll for the day. I will be updating numbers all the way from now until the end of October when the last polls have been run, and in October or November, we're going to have a massive video event where your comments will be read, all the numbers will be crunched, and the monsters will be reordered based on how you all voted. Every vote on every poll matters, and anyone has a chance to have their comment read in the video itself. And if you want to help me get more data and reach the broader Monster Hunter community, I'd appreciate a like on this video and, maybe hit the subscribe button to help this channel grow. It'll put me and this project in front of more eyes. Okay, no more YouTuber CTA shilling. Here's the video you actually clicked on. Thank you. Gonna be honest, there ain't even all that much of a huge point or a pitch to this video. I just want to talk about these dudes. Early game Monster Hunter monsters. The goobers, the weirdos, and the ugly ducklings running around out in the world, and they get slapped down twice and then they kind of get forgotten about by some players. I don't know, man. I think they're great. And, that's a universal statement across all of Monster Hunter, but as a bit of a central pillar for the video, I do want to eventually highlight Sunbreak in a couple of places and how that game handles these early game monsters. We'll get back to that in a bit, though. Ever since Monster Hunter began, the first couple bosses you face, those speed bumps on 1 and 2 star quests, are so consistently charming and creative and world-defining, and if I'm being 100% honest, occasionally a little annoying, but the annoying ones have tapered off pretty hard since the second generation, and we've mostly been left with these little cool guys who fill out the maps of Monster Hunter and make the world feel whole. The biggest downside to these dudes is that they're often so easily bypassed and forgotten. Occasionally, you may have a lower level monster with weapons whose status is pretty rare in that game, or they might have an armor set that has an obscure niche skill that you need for a build, so making their gear can sometimes be worthwhile, but for the most part, once you hit the tier monsters where you're fighting flagships and elder dragons, there's hardly any need to battle the starter monsters. So they tend to fade into the background, only being hunted 2 or 3 times in some playthroughs. Yes, I do see the comedy in saying that it's sad that the weakest creatures in Monster Hunter only get brutally killed a couple of times as opposed to dozens. Monster Hunter's weird, killing is kind of a love language for us. This is one reason why I think the seamless maps and increased monster populations on a quest was a great call that the 5th generation games made. You might not be fighting Great Jagras or Dodogama or Radoban or Paolumu all that much, but you see them trudging along and flying through the air and minding their own business, or accidentally getting swept up in the big battles every once in a while. It helps to remind you that they're still around, that the environment and ecosystem needs these jobbers so that everything thrives. In the older games where having a second boss on the map was more rare of an occasion, and every area was bookended by loading zones, it could be kind of easy to go the bulk of your endgame without seeing much of any of the raptors, or the bears, or the early bird wyverns, or something like that. I sometimes forget that certain monsters are even on the generation's ultimate roster. Despite the failings it has in terms of pacing, this is one reason I really appreciate the anomaly system in Sunbreak's endgame, and part of the reason I wanted to give this game specifically a shout out in this video. Out of all the Monster Hunter games I've played, Sunbreak offers up the most incentive for you to backtrack and face some of the earlier boss monsters due to the fact that they contain some special anomaly parts that you can't get on other monsters, and occasionally Bahari will mark them as a priority target for you to get more rewards from. I always really appreciated this system for that fact, and was often pretty happy to see something like, Arzuros or Great Ragi or Actisom coming up as the priority target. It's a system that allows Sunbreak to flex the full extent of its bestiary, and considering Sunbreak has a pretty stellar monster roster both in terms of members and fight design, that's a mark in the game's favor as far as I'm concerned. On top of that, all monster parts are pretty valuable for charm melding. I think Sunbreak does a better job than all of its predecessors at making its whole roster feel important and necessary and worth hunting. And don't get me wrong, there are other Monster Hunter games where I'll happily depower myself and go fight the easier bosses for the fun factor of the battle, battle, but I kind of respect that Sunbreak said, nah, these guys are cool and they deserve to be fought more than twice. Maybe you're not a fan of the fact that the afflicted parts were so thinly spread among certain monsters and it made grinding specific parts a bit padded, and I can respect that opinion, but as someone who was never obsessed with min-maxing my builds or getting to the end of the anomaly grind, I was incredibly happy to find that there was just a Monster Hunter game that actively incentivized me towards battling every single monster in the roster with some degree of regularity instead of just limply leaving that as an option on the table. Unfortunately, the anomaly system couldn't do too much to make low-level monster armor and weapons relevant, but unless they decide to give every armor set in the game a world-style set mastery bonus, I don't think that's too likely to happen. There needs to be some progression in stats and numbers as the monster gets more and more powerful. Honestly, I think this is where layered armor and weapons come in, which Sunbreak also handled masterfully, and I'm glad that it looks like layered gear is going to be just a permanent addition to the series from here on out. What I think is the coolest thing about these guys is that there's a lot less pressure on the early game bosses to be these amazing, eye-catching, grander than grand creations that need to sell game copies. They get to kind of just be themselves and doof around, and you can be a lot more experimental with the monsters who aren't as important for game sales because it's less mandatory for them to be very outwardly cool. For that reason, they get to avoid some of the combat and personality design patterns as well as the very commonly reused body shapes that some of the stronger, tougher monsters will find themselves sharing. There's no need for the lower level monsters to breathe world-shattering lightning or conjure hurricanes with a snap of a finger because that's not their role. They have much more low-key arsenals at their disposal, like cunning survival tactics and sneaky weaponry and predator-repelling defenses that keep them alive and thriving in a world teeming with terrifyingly powerful monstrosities. And the funny thing about that is, first of all, because the early game boss monsters have less of an incentive to be blatantly cool, that kind of wraps back around towards them still being their own kind of cool, because established fans of Monster Hunter are expecting there to be and are charmed by the early game oddball monsters who will be there at the start of the game. And second of all, their more simple and explainable abilities can oftentimes allow the earlier game boss monsters to be the more interesting creatures in Monster Hunter, not so much as video game bosses, but as living animals. Put simply, it is far, far easier for the lower threat level monsters to not have to cross the suspension of disbelief event horizon when it comes to explaining how they do what they do. For a number of very powerful monsters in the series, you kinda just need to believe that yeah, in this universe, an animal can slam itself onto the ground at Mach 1 and not liquefy itself, or monsters can exhale visible balls of purple rabies virus and curved arc shots and also the diseased balls explode, or members of an animal species that developed in a volcanic region somehow can then migrate to a frigid tundra and then mutate into a subspecies that's perfectly suited to living in that environment instead of all of those migrants immediately all dying. Stuff like this happens frequently enough in Monster Hunter and has been going on long enough in the series that it doesn't really contradict with the universe's internal consistency, but with a lot of monsters, there's a point where you kinda just have to accept that these things are possible. And since Monster Hunter is a franchise that has a lot of pride in the real-world biological inspirations of its animals, the simpler creatures that don't need to invoke suspension of disbelief to explain themselves are a real treat to learn about because it is far more rare for them to hit that stopping point where you kind of just have to accept that something is what it is. Do you know that when a Quechua folds its ears over its face to try and use the patterns on the back of the ears to make himself look intimidating, he effectively blinds himself and uses the fact that his ears are pointed down to keenly detect incoming footsteps so he can attack accordingly? How about the fact that Gendrome venom is 1, powerful enough to drop monsters far larger than itself, and 2, doesn't shut down your nerve endings when he starts eating you? Nope. just paralyzes the muscles. You feel everything after that. He and his pack also have these scales that overlap in a way that is particularly tight and dense so that they don't paralyze each other by accident when they attack in a frenzy. Oh, and how about the fact that the mane of the Royal Ludroth serves as water retention for his survival, vital defense for certain internal organs, and a tool for pack hydration simultaneously. There's tons of little factoids and details and small behaviors to learn about all the monsters of Monster Hunter, but I think the early game creatures tend to get the most interesting grab bag of details since their bodies aren't built with quite as much of a need to be an engine of destruction. I think it's due to the fact that these guys need to fight a lot harder for the right to stay alive in ecosystems this brutal that they get to feel a little bit more fleshed out, because they still need to hunt, but they also need to deceive and evade and camouflage themselves, whereas something big and strong and nigh unchallengeable like his Zenogre has a really cool set of mechanisms that grant him his electrical abilities, but he doesn't have as much explanation given to him about other aspects of his ecology outside of that electrical apparatus. And let me be clear, I'm sure there's some early game monsters that need to invoke some degree of suspension of disbelief, and I know that there's plenty of cool non-combat details built into the bigger, badder creatures. I'm just saying, there's a bit of a skew. And another big component that solidifies the early game monsters as intriguing animals out and about in the environment is that so many of these species have pack members, subordinates, and physically fit younger members of their species out there on the maps and aiding them in combat. Once again, this is not a trait that is completely unique to low difficulty Monster Hunter monsters, but it is a trait more commonly found amongst that group. A lot of these early game bosses are kinda pushovers, even against hunters fighting at a proper gear level, so they weave pack tactics into their battle plans to give themselves a much needed advantage. A lot of people could probably take or leave having, 6 little baby raptors constantly nipping at their heels while they're trying to fight the big boss raptor, especially if those little raptors can also inflict fun little ailments like poison and paralysis, but I don't know, I would rather have them than not have them, and the little ones are typically pretty easy to get rid of and perfectly fine to deal with. Except you. Fuck you. Honestly, in some of the tougher early Monster Hunter games, eliminating the pack should be a part of your opening strategy, and thinking of the pack as an extension of the boss itself makes the system more endearing to me. I'll harp on this point again, but it's stuff like this that really helps make the world of Monster Hunter feel full and growing and breathing. You could be wandering on a beach and see a few hermitars foraging around the coastline when a towering daimyo hermitar comes up from under the sand and finds something to snack on with the other crabs. Oftentimes you'll see the big boss raptors like Velocidrome or Great Jaggy out on the hunt and being flanked by some of their subordinate raptors. Beasts like Blangonga have such a firm command over the lesser Blangos that his roar will summon the smaller members of the species to aid the Blangonga in combat. The Ludroth, who follow a Royal Ludroth, are all females within the alpha male's harem, whom he will fight tooth and nail to defend. Gyros are typically opportunistic little cowards who will become much bolder when their alpha Great Gyros enters a fight. And as gross as it is to actually describe, one of the neatest interactions in Monster Hunter World, and one of the key moments that was used to define how the game was going to expand upon the animalistic behaviors of the monsters, was by having a Great Jaguar swallow up an Aptonoth whole, carry the decomposing food chunks in its gullet, and cough up the remains for the younger Jaguars to eat. The animals of Monster Hunter have these social hierarchies with separate relationships. Some of them are rigid bonds, while others exist only for mutual gain. The presence of small monster packs adds a layer of personality to the larger bosses simply by how they associate with one another. You may not always be fighting these little guys, but they fill up the environment so well. They're dangerous in numbers, they add chaos to what may have otherwise been a simple fight, and they have a lot to say about how certain species interact with other members of their own kind. The only thing that's kind of weird about the small monster pack thing is this trend that a couple of the more recent games have fallen into where the packs are around but the boss isn't. This has happened to Great Jaggy twice, and I'm not thrilled about it. It also sucks when the developers make a pack of really cool small monsters and then don't give them an alpha. Where's my Great Wolg, Capcom? You made these super cool Wolverine badger skunks that doof around in the snow and you didn't give them a big one. I want my giant evil skunk Wolverine. I know that not every single kind of small monster has to have a huge alpha built into their species, but that shouldn't be the case for the coolest small monsters you ever made. The farting pink hippo monkeys have a boss monster. I don't want excuses. And what really slaps a bow on the charm and personality and eccentricities of the early game boss monsters is that every player has a first, and so does every game. Every hunter has their first boss monster that they ever took down. Every hunter has that opening gauntlet of beasts they had to cobble together a makeshift set of low-rank armor out of. Every Monster Hunter adventure starts off with its own entourage of introductory monsters that will set the groundwork for the big bads later down the line. These early game monsters are special to a lot of people. They'll help introduce you to the game's combat, to a game's new mechanics, to statuses and elements and wind pressure and loud roars and item usage. They teach you the do's and the don'ts and the things to look out for, the tools that the stronger monsters are going to be elaborating on in the future. One issue I have with the Village Quest and the 5th generation games being a good bit easier than those of the older titles is that the earlier boss monsters tend to have fairly lackluster damage, and thus they don't do quite as good a job teaching a player that they should value defensive skills as well as offensive skills. And who am I kidding? The new kids are just gonna look up builds on the internet anyway. The teaching role that some of these monsters have are so respected and important that, for example, over in Japan, Yeon Kutku has the nickname Kutku Sensei, as he is the first true challenge that the original Monster Hunter game put in front of his players. He teaches you about wind pressure from flying monsters, the important utilization of tools like sonic bombs, how to track flying monsters, and to watch out for monsters with projectile weapons. From doing this community poll event I've been running, I've read a lot of really great comments from players describing the respect that they have for certain monsters who taught them valuable lessons from Monster Hunter. In a lot of cases, though, this can be where the combat relevance of weaker Monster Hunter monsters can kinda run out. Sure, they teach you a lot of important lessons about Monster Hunter combat, but they'll leave the best execution of these concepts for the later game fights. Quite often, weaker Monster Hunter monsters will have the least elaborate combos, the simplest implementations of certain gimmicks, and the shallowest move pools. And yeah, it makes sense that the more powerful monsters have more elaborate combat design, but it could sometimes hurt the replayability of the high personality early game monsters. This trend starts to change a bit around Monster Hunter Tri, as monsters like Kurapeko and Royal Ludroth and Gobel were given larger grab bags of status ailments and deeper move pools and better animations, and Monster Hunter 4 then comes around and did a really good job for its early game bosses as well, continuing the solid groundwork that Tri laid out by creating a list of new monsters that all felt super unique in terms of design and combat. You have a big flying around beetle like Celtis, and a vine-swinging monkey in Quetzalwacha, and a big bulky rock-crushing bullfrog in Tetsukabra, and a cunning spider in Ursula, and they all have such drastically different animal inspirations and attacks, and it's a far departure from the asset reuse that some of the earlier Monster Hunter games had to put up with their early game monsters. And far and away, the game that treats its early game roster the best in terms of combat design is Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Yeah, we're back around to this game again. This video's a low-key second Sunbreak love letter, and you can't stop me. Do yourself a favor and either go fight the afflicted forms of the lower level monsters in Sunbreak, or power down your build a little bit and fight them normally. A ton of them are ridiculously fun, and I'm gonna give the base game of Rise a lot of credit too. They absolutely cared about the early entries in their monster roster. Rise feels like the first game where the developers said there's no reason why the combat design of the introductory bosses can't be as deep, fun, and fast-paced as the later fights. Yeah, there's a cutoff point, of course, where things like Elder Dragons have to get crazier, but Rise did such a good job designing its new monsters. Bisheten is a gliding monkey with 2 fighting stances and a menagerie of status-inflicting fruits he can fling at you. Tetranodon is a sumo wrestler platypus that actually does a good job selling sumo moves as actual physical monster attacks and regurgitates high-pressure blasts of water at you. Somnicanth is a sleep gas-emitting siren snake that entraps her enemies and then weaponizes shellfish she digs up to blind them and blow them up. Great Izuchi takes the classic raptor boss gimmick, adds a fox-like mammalian spin to it, adds a scythe blade tail, and then does synchronized attacks with its underlings. You have Acnosom, who is this incredibly well-animated, very graceful bird wyvern that has a lot of kicks and flips and repositioning attacks, as well as these dazzling, bouncing fireball attacks. And all of these monsters, plus the returning cast of early game monsters, get much faster and are granted new moves in Sunbreak. Sunbreak kicks World's ass with its own monsters. Tobi Kadachi in Sunbreak is a fast fast-acting, spine-throwing living bolt of lightning, who activates his static electricity mode way earlier in the fight than Worlds does. Thus, his more dangerous attacks and his heightened stun chance are much bigger factors in the battle in Sunbreak. Pookie goes from the cool, goofy guy that I like seeing around in World to a legitimate, like, 8 out of 10 fight in Sunbreak for his difficulty level, due to the implementation of these fast, frequent flying kicks and these breath weapon attacks he stole from his coral subspecies, a distance-clearing poison spit charge where he goes lobbing a whole bunch of his toxic projectiles in an artillery arc, and just like a really great pace to the actual battle. Giratodus is fun in this game. He's way faster, he uses his mud to box you in so he can check you or slam into you, his mud projectile's a spread shot, he tries to outmaneuver you, he's got a proper roar, he's nice and nimble in the water. He's still only like a 5 out of 10, but that's a big step up from World where I felt next to nothing for him. Bro, Sunbreak's combat design is so good, it makes Kezu kinda decent. Man, this game had problems, but when it does good, it kicks ass. I meant what I said earlier, dude. Boot up Sunbreak, run a casual build, and just go have fun with the lightweights. It's a legitimately good time. So, I hope you enjoyed this big, semi-disjointed appreciation post for the often overlooked monsters in Monster Hunter. I think they're a pretty integral part of the franchise DNA and can contain some of the best and most fleshed out animals that the series has to offer. And some of the fights are really only held back by low damage and health. They're teachers, they're pack leaders, world builders, and are less burdened by the need to have mass appeal. These guys deserve their time in the sun, and so many of them are worth backtracking to face again just for the sheer fun of it. If you enjoyed this video, may I suggest this video right here, where I hyper-focus on one of my all-time favorite early game monsters, the Royal Ludroth. But for now, this has been CR-Volcanic or Connor. I'll see you around. Shout out to all the patrons, and special shout out to Nihilist Chimerax, Datboy Doin de Ding, Sir Newt Newt, Peaberry, Stefan Colneen, Shaggy Grizzly, Psychotic Jester, Pecco Plush, Daniel Delasarte, and Call Sign Shadow. Thank you very much, everyone.